I never expected that night to change the way I saw everything, my career, my choices, and especially the man I had worked alongside for over a decade. But some moments sneak up on you when you least expect them, unfolding like a perfectly orchestrated symphony, each note striking something deep within you. It started as an ordinary evening. The company's annual gala had just wrapped up, and the city lights shimmered through the wide glass windows of the rooftop venue. The laughter of colleagues still echoed in my ears as I stepped outside, inhaling the crisp night air, grateful for a moment of quiet. My heels pinched, a small price for hours of standing, smiling, playing my part. Leaving already? I turned to see him, James Carter, my boss for the past 12 years, silver at the temples, impeccably dressed, always carrying the quiet confidence of a man who had built something from the ground up. At 61, he was as composed as ever, but tonight there was something different in his expression. "Just getting some air," I replied, offering a small smile. "Quite a party," he said, stepping beside me, hands tucked into his pockets. The streetlights softened his usually sharp presence. "It was," I admitted, then chuckled. "Though to be honest, these events aren't really my thing." "Funny," he mused, tilting his head. "You always seem to enjoy them." I shrugged. "I've learned to play the part." He let out a low laugh, and for a moment we stood in a comfortable silence. The city hummed around us, but right then it felt like just the two of us, outside the rigid formalities of the office. Then came the words I never expected. "I'm not ready to go home yet," he admitted. "Would you care to join me for a drink?" I hesitated. It wasn't unusual for us to talk outside of work, late-night calls, strategy meetings that stretched long past business hours. But this felt different. There was something in his voice, something that made my pulse quicken just a little. "Sure," I finally said. "Why not?" We walked down the street, away from the bright-lit towers of downtown, into a quieter part of the city. He led me to a small lounge, intimate, with low lighting and soft jazz playing in the background. A place that felt timeless, untouched by the rush of the world outside. As we settled into a corner booth, he loosened his tie, a rare sight. Then he looked at me, really looked at me, as if seeing me for the first time. "You've been with the company a long time," he said, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. 12 years? I nodded. "Ever wonder what life might have looked like if you'd chosen a different path?" His question caught me off guard. "Are you asking if I have regrets?" He shook his head. "Not regrets, just curiosity." "Do you ever think about the roads not taken?" I exhaled slowly. "I think we all do at some point. But I've always believed that every choice, every turn, leads us exactly where we're meant to be." He smiled at that. "That's a wise way of looking at things." And just like that, we talked. Really talked. Not about work, deadlines, or quarterly reports, but about life. He told me about his early struggles, the sacrifices that came with building the company. I shared pieces of myself too, the dreams I once had, the moments that shaped me. Time blurred. One drink became 2, then 3. Somewhere between reminiscing and laughter, the air shifted. He reached across the table, his fingers brushing the back of my hand, hesitant, searching. I didn't pull away. A moment, a suspended breath. Then quietly, he said, "I never told you this, but I've always admired you. Beyond just your work, you have this presence and this way of making the world feel grounded, even when everything else is chaos." My heartbeat quickened. I was no stranger to compliments, but this felt different. It wasn't flattery, it was something deeper, something real. "You've always been the one constant," he continued, his voice quieter now. And maybe it took me too long to realize just how much that means. I swallowed, unsure how to respond. He wasn't just my boss, he was a man I had respected for years. A man whose opinion I had valued more than I cared to admit. And yet, in that dimly lit lounge, I wasn't thinking about work or professionalism. I was thinking about the way he looked at me, as if finally allowing himself to see me, not just as his employee, but as a woman. "I should probably head home," I said at last, though my voice lacked conviction. He held my gaze for a long moment, then nodded. "Let me walk you." The streets were quieter now, the city settling into its late-night rhythm. When we reached my building, we lingered at the entrance. "Thank you for tonight," he said. "For listening." I smiled. "I could say the same to you." A pause, a hesitation. And before I could second-guess myself, I leaned in, just slightly. Just enough. It was the kind of moment where the world narrows to two people, where the past and future fade, leaving only the now. But before anything more could happen, I pulled back, my breath unsteady. "Good night, James," I whispered, stepping inside before I could lose myself completely. As the door closed behind me, I pressed my back against it, heart pounding, because something had shifted between us. And deep down I knew this was only the beginning. The next morning, I woke earlier than usual, my mind still tangled in the events of the previous night. The way James had looked at me, the warmth of his hand against mine, the unspoken words hanging between us. For years, I had only seen him as my boss, a man of authority, respect, and distance. But now I couldn't stop thinking about him as James, the man who had let his guard down, the man who had looked at me in a way that made my pulse race. I shook my head, trying to clear my thoughts as I poured my morning coffee. This was ridiculous. Nothing had happened. Nothing could happen. But as I walked into the office, I felt it, the shift. A tension lingering in the air, subtle yet undeniable. I caught sight of him through the glass of his office. He was on a call, but for the briefest moment, his eyes flicked up and met mine. A pause, a hesitation. Then the smallest of smiles, one only I would notice. And I felt it, like a quiet storm beneath my skin. The day passed in a blur, but my mind kept drifting. It didn't help that James seemed more present than usual, stopping by my desk more than necessary, holding my gaze just a second too long. By late afternoon, I was restless. I needed air, clarity. I stepped onto the small office terrace, inhaling the crisp autumn air. The city buzzed below, a symphony of distant honks and chatter. I was so lost in thought I didn't hear the door open behind me. "You've been avoiding me?" His voice was calm, but there was an edge to it. I turned, forcing a light chuckle. "Avoiding you? That's a bit dramatic." He stepped closer, hands tucked into his pockets, his expression unreadable. "Is it?" I sighed, rubbing my temples. "James, last night was different," he finished for me. "I know." I looked at him, the man I had worked beside for so many years, and yet in that moment, he felt unfamiliar. Or maybe, for the first time, I was seeing him clearly. "We can't do this," I said quietly. But even as the words left my lip, they felt hollow. "I know what you're thinking. This is risky and it changes everything." "It does change things," I said firmly. "James, you're my boss. There are rules, expectations." "I don't care about rules," he interrupted, his voice low but certain. I stared at him. This wasn't the composed, methodical man I'd known for years. This was someone different, someone who, for once, wasn't thinking about business, control, or responsibility. He was thinking about me. "You're overcomplicating this," he said, his tone softer now. "Last night, we weren't boss and employee. We were just two people. And I know we both felt something. I swallowed hard. That doesn't mean it's right. He tilted his head, searching my expression. And yet, you haven't said you don't feel it too. I opened my mouth, but the words wouldn't come, because the truth was there, heavy and undeniable. I had felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. He took a step closer, his voice barely above a whisper. Tell me I'm wrong and I'll drop it. I'll forget last night ever happened. I wanted to say the words, step back, pretend everything could return to normal, but I didn't, because deep down I wasn't sure I wanted things to go back to the way they were. The air between us crackled with an invisible pull. My breath hitched as his fingers brushed against my wrist, not a demand, just a question. And for the first time in years, I didn't want to think. I didn't pull away. His touch was barely there, but I felt it everywhere. My pulse quickened, warmth spreading through me like a quiet storm. For years I had lived inside the lines of expectation, my career, my age, the neat, predictable life I had built. But standing here with James, looking at me like I was something new, something unexpected, I felt those walls shift. He was waiting, watching for any sign that I wanted this as much as he did. And in that moment, I did. I exhaled. James, I don't know where this leads. He gave a small smile. Neither do I, but that doesn't mean we have to run from it. A cool breeze brushed past, and I shivered. Without hesitation, he slipped off his suit jacket and draped it over my shoulders. The scent of his cologne, warm, familiar, something faintly spiced, wrapped around me. Come on, he said, nodding toward the office door. Let's get out of here. I hesitated. You mean now? Why not? His voice was light, but underneath there was something else, something quietly determined. I glanced through the glass doors. Inside, the office buzzed with its usual end-of-day rhythm, people gathering their things, settling into their routines. If I went back in, I knew exactly how the night would go. I'd head home, make dinner, and sit alone with my thoughts, pretending nothing had changed. But something had changed. And for once, I didn't want to let an opportunity pass me by. All right, I said, my voice steadier than I expected. Let's go. We ended up in a quiet, dimly lit restaurant just a few blocks away, the kind of place where the music was soft, the waiters spoke in hushed tones, and time seemed to slow. James ordered a bottle of wine, and as the first sip warmed my throat, I felt myself start to relax. So, I said, setting my glass down, what exactly are we doing here? He leaned back, watching me with that unreadable expression he always wore in the office. But tonight, there was something different behind it. Honestly? He swirled his wine, watching the deep red liquid catch the light. I just wanted to be somewhere with you, somewhere we didn't have to pretend. Pretend? I echoed.